June, 217 BC. A Roman army of over 30,000 men marches confidently along the shores of Lake Trasimene in central Italy. Their commander, Consul Gaius Flaminius, believes he is on the verge of glory. Ahead of them, the enemy, Hannibal Barca, seems to be retreating, fleeing south in desperation. To Flaminius, it looks like an opportunity to crush Carthage once and for all. But the Romans are not hunting Hannibal. Hannibal is hunting them. Hidden in the morning mist, Carthaginian soldiers lie in wait, thousands of spears and swords glinting faintly. The valley itself is a deadly trap, and the Romans are marching straight into it. By the time the fog lifts, the calm waters of Lake Trasimene will run red with Roman blood, and Hannibal's cunning will become the stuff of nightmares for Rome forever. The stage is set. The year was 217 BC, and the Roman Republic was already in turmoil. Rome had underestimated Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general whose daring campaign across the Alps had stunned the ancient world. Thousands of soldiers, including elephants, had crossed mountains thought impassable, and Hannibal's presence in Italy was a constant threat. The Republic had suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Trebia, losing many men to his clever tactics. Rome's pride was wounded, and the Senate demanded immediate action to restore their honor. To lead this next campaign, Rome appointed Consul Gaius Flaminius, a man known for his fiery temper and relentless ambition. Flaminius was determined to confront Hannibal before the Carthaginian army could grow stronger, believing that decisive action would secure glory for himself and Rome. He had little patience for caution, believing that speed and aggression could compensate for strategy. The Senate, eager for victory, encouraged his boldness, unaware that it was exactly what Hannibal wanted them to be. Meanwhile, Hannibal was not idle. He had spent months observing Roman tactics, learning their patterns, and understanding their psychology. He knew that Rome depended on numbers and brute force, often marching directly at their enemies with little regard for the terrain or subtlety. Hannibal realized that to defeat them, he didn't need to outfight them in open combat. He needed to outthink them. The area around Lake Trasimene in Umbria provided the perfect stage for this. The valley was narrow, bordered by steep hills on one side and the lake on the other. Mist often hovered over the water in the early morning, creating a natural cover for ambush. Hannibal positioned his troops carefully along the hillsides, hiding his infantry and cavalry where the Romans would least expect them. Every path, every ridge, and every bend in the road became a potential weapon in his hands. As the Romans marched south, confident and unaware, they were walking directly into Hannibal's trap. Flaminius pushed his army forward, convinced that Hannibal was retreating. The soldiers, armored and disciplined, kept formation along the narrow lakeside path, unaware that their very confidence would soon be exploited. Hannibal, patient and calculating, waited silently in the shadows, knowing that Rome's arrogance and haste would do half the work for him. In this moment, history hung in the balance. One impulsive decision by a Roman consul, one clever maneuver by a Carthaginian general, would determine the fate of tens of thousands of men. The stage was set. The trap was ready. And the morning fog of Lake Trasimene would soon conceal one of the most devastating ambushes the ancient world had ever witnessed. Hannibal's strategy of deception. Hannibal Barca was not a general who relied on brute force alone. He understood that the mind could be a weapon just as deadly as a sword. After months in Italy, observing Roman armies and their patterns, Hannibal knew one thing for certain: Rome would act rashly if provoked, and arrogance would be their downfall. He planned to exploit it. Instead of meeting the Romans head-on, Hannibal chose a strategy of calculated retreat. He moved his army slowly southward through central Italy, devastating the countryside as he went. Farms were burned, supplies seized, and towns abandoned. This scorched earth tactic served a dual purpose. It weakened Roman resources while creating the illusion that Hannibal was fleeing in fear. Flaminius, burning with pride and eager to avenge previous defeats, took the bait. The Roman consul was convinced that Hannibal's army was vulnerable, overextended, and ripe for destruction. Without sending proper scouts ahead or fully considering the terrain, Flaminius ordered his troops to pursue immediately. The Romans believed they were in control, but they were unknowingly being guided toward a deadly trap. Hannibal's genius lay in his patience. His infantry and cavalry were carefully arranged along the hills and forests surrounding Lake Trasimene, hidden from view. He knew that visibility in the early morning fog would be poor, and that the Romans would advance blindly along the narrow lakeside road. Every detail of the environment, the mist, the lake, the cliffs, was used to mask his forces and mislead the enemy. The Carthaginian army appeared smaller than it actually was, reinforcing the illusion of weakness. Hannibal's troops along the hills were instructed to stay silent and concealed until the Romans were deep inside the valley. His cavalry, positioned on the flanks, waited for the precise moment to strike, while infantry units were ready to descend and encircle the enemy. By manipulating perception, terrain, and timing, Hannibal had set the perfect stage for one of the greatest ambushes in history. The Romans, driven by overconfidence and a desire for quick victory, were marching directly into his hands. Each step they took along the lakeside path brought them closer to a deadly embrace, orchestrated with the precision of a master strategist. Hannibal's strategy of deception was simple yet brilliant: make the enemy act first, follow their impulses, and turn their strength against them. The stage was set. The trap was ready. And Flaminius was about to fall right into it. The geography of the trap. The secret of Hannibal's ambush lay not only in his mind but also in the very land itself. Lake Trasimene, located in the heart of Umbria, offered a natural stage for a trap that would make even the largest Roman army vulnerable. The lake stretched along a narrow valley, hemmed in by steep hills on one side and water on the other. A single road ran between the hills and the lake, forcing armies to march in a long, thin column. In the early morning, a thick mist often hung over the valley. This fog would make it nearly impossible for advancing troops to see what lay ahead or to spot enemy soldiers hidden along the slopes. Hannibal knew this would give him a critical advantage. The Romans could not identify danger until it was too late. Hannibal carefully placed his troops along the terrain. Hidden infantry crouched in the hills, waiting to strike. Cavalry units took positions on the flanks, ready to cut off any attempt at retreat. Even the forests along the hills were used as cover, concealing archers and slingers prepared to rain projectiles down on unsuspecting Romans. Every tree, rock, and ridge became a weapon in Hannibal's hands. The narrowness of the road was crucial. It meant that Roman soldiers could not form their usual battle lines. The massive legions, so effective in open fields, were forced into a tight, confined space where movement was restricted. The Romans' strength in numbers became a weakness. Crowded together, they could not maneuver or respond effectively once the ambush began. Hannibal's genius was in seeing the battlefield as a three-dimensional puzzle. The hills, the lake, the road, and the fog were all pieces of a deadly trap. He used the terrain to channel the Romans into a corridor where escape would be impossible, and where every step brought them closer to disaster. By the time the Roman army entered the valley, they were already prisoners of geography. Hannibal's forces were invisible, waiting for the perfect moment. The combination of mist, hills, lake, and narrow road made the Romans vulnerable in ways they could never have anticipated. Lake Trasimene was no ordinary battlefield. It was a theater of cunning, a carefully prepared stage where Hannibal's strategy of deception would be executed with lethal precision. The Romans, confident in their power and unafraid of any danger, were walking into a trap designed to crush their arrogance and rewrite the history of war forever. The Roman march into doom. The morning of June 21, 217 BC, dawned over the misty valley of Lake Trasimene. Roman soldiers, nearly 30,000 strong, moved in disciplined formation along the narrow lakeside road. Their commander, Consul Gaius Flaminius, marched at the head of the column, confident that Hannibal was retreating and that victory was close at hand. The men were armored and well equipped, their shields gleaming faintly through the fog, and their morale high. But what the Romans did not realize was that they were marching straight into the perfectly prepared ambush. The valley was silent except for the echo of their own footsteps and the occasional rustle of the mist-covered hills. Scouts sent ahead saw nothing, and Flaminius, driven by pride and impatience, ignored warnings of possible danger. He believed that the Carthaginian army was scattered and vulnerable, unaware that Hannibal had deliberately chosen this moment to strike. As the column moved deeper into the corridor between the lake and the hills, the Romans were increasingly constrained. The road was narrow, forcing the men into a tight, elongated formation, unable to form their usual battle lines. The lake hemmed them in on one side, while the hills loomed ominously on the other. Each step they took pushed them further into Hannibal's trap. Meanwhile, Hannibal's troops lay hidden in the hills, barely visible through the thick fog. Archers and slingers crouched silently, ready to rain projectiles down once the signal was given. Cavalry units waited on the flanks, prepared to sweep around and cut off any escape. The Carthaginian army was perfectly positioned to strike from all sides simultaneously, while the Romans marched blindly forward, confident and unaware. Flaminius, believing he was leading a victorious pursuit, pressed the army further into the valley. The mist grew thicker, muffling sounds and obscuring vision. Soldiers could barely see the hills, let alone any sign of Hannibal's forces. The tension was invisible, yet palpable, the air heavy with anticipation that only one side truly understood. By the time the Romans reached the heart of the valley, they were completely inside the trap. The combination of narrow terrain, mist, and the hidden Carthaginian forces meant that their strength in numbers would now work against them. They were no longer an army advancing on an enemy. They were prisoners of Hannibal's strategy, walking into a deadly corridor from which there would be no escape. The stage was set. The trap was ready. The massacre was about to begin. The ambush unleashed. As the Roman army of 30,000 marched deeper into the valley, the calm of the morning fog shattered in an instant. Hannibal gave the silent signal, and the trap snapped shut. From the hills, Carthaginian infantry and slingers poured down upon the unsuspecting Romans. Arrows and javelins rained from above, striking soldiers before they even had a chance to raise their shields. On the flanks, Hannibal's cavalry swept around, cutting off escape routes and isolating groups of Romans along the lakeshore. The lake itself became a natural barrier. There was no way to flee forward, and retreat was impossible without plunging into the cold waters. The Romans, trained for open-field battles, found themselves confined in a narrow corridor where they could not form proper lines or maneuver effectively. Panic spread quickly through the Roman ranks. Soldiers shouted, tried to regroup, and struggled to form defenses, but the tight formation turned against them. The heavier infantry was crushed against the lake, while Carthaginian troops from the hills pressed in relentlessly. Flaminius himself attempted to rally his men, riding among them with his standard held high, but chaos reigned. Miscommunication, fear, and confusion paralyzed the army. Hannibal's men fought with calculated precision, not just brute force. Groups of Romans were surrounded, cut off, and overwhelmed in pockets, while others were forced toward the lake. Carthaginian cavalry struck from behind, ensuring that no retreat was possible. Soldiers who tried to break free were immediately surrounded, trapped between the cliffs, the lake, and Hannibal's encircling forces. The fog, once a veil of safety, now hid terror in every direction. The sound of screams, clashing metal, and horses' hooves filled the valley. Within hours, tens of thousands of Romans were dead or captured, a number so staggering that it sent shockwaves through the Republic. What had begun as a confident march had turned into a total disaster. The Romans had walked willingly into Hannibal's trap, and the valley of Lake Trasimene became a tomb for thousands. This ambush, carefully orchestrated and executed, demonstrated Hannibal's genius. It wasn't just about killing soldiers. It was about psychology, timing, and mastery of terrain. Rome had underestimated him once again, and the cost was catastrophic. The massacre at Lake Trasimene would go down in history as one of the greatest ambushes ever, a perfect example of strategy overpowering sheer numbers. The massacre and its horrors. By the time the fog began to lift over Lake Trasimene, the full scale of the disaster became clear. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers lay dead, scattered along the narrow valley and drowned in the lake. Carthaginian forces had executed the ambush with chilling precision, leaving little chance for escape. Shields were shattered, swords broken, and the once proud Roman legions were reduced to chaos and carnage. Hannibal's men moved methodically, ensuring that no groups of Romans could regroup. Cavalry cut off the few who tried to flee, while infantry descended from the hills to crush resistance. Every direction was blocked. There was no way to retreat, no way to fight effectively in formation. Panic turned to terror, and terror turned to slaughter. Ancient accounts estimate that around 15,000 Romans were killed in a single morning, with many more captured, marking Lake Trasimene as one of the bloodiest ambushes in history. The psychological impact was just as devastating. News of the massacre spread quickly, sending shockwaves through Rome. Families awaited the return of soldiers who would never come home. The Republic was left stunned and fearful. Flaminius himself was killed in the fighting, his body lost among the thousands. Rome had suffered a humiliation of unimaginable proportions. Even in the midst of this horror, Hannibal remained calm. His victory was complete yet measured. He understood that total destruction of Rome was impossible without siege equipment. Instead, he allowed his soldiers to rest and regroup, having demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of strategy, terrain, and timing over brute force. Insert subscribe prompt here naturally. If you're fascinated by stories of legendary battles and the genius behind them, make sure to hit the subscribe button and join us as we uncover more moments where strategy changed the course of history. The massacre at Lake Trasimene was not just a military victory, it was a psychological blow. Hannibal had proven that an entire Roman army could be trapped and destroyed through cunning, patience, and a masterful use of terrain. The valley, once serene and misty, had become a symbol of Rome's vulnerability and Hannibal's brilliance. Aftermath and panic in Rome. The news of the massacre at Lake Trasimene reached Rome like a thunderclap. Citizens, already fearful after previous Carthaginian victories, were thrown into panic and despair. Rome had suffered staggering losses, tens of thousands of soldiers dead, including a consul, and entire legions shattered. The streets of the city were filled with whispers of disaster, fear, and uncertainty. The Senate, desperate to prevent further chaos, convened immediately. They realized that Rome's usual approach of direct confrontation would not work against Hannibal. Instead, they appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus, a cautious and methodical leader, as dictator. Fabius' strategy, later known as the Fabian strategy, avoided direct battles with Hannibal. He focused on harassing the Carthaginian army, cutting off supplies, and forcing them to stretch their lines, delaying engagement until Rome could regain strength. The psychological impact on Rome was immense. Families mourned soldiers who would never return, and panic spread among local communities. Merchants, farmers, and townspeople worried about Hannibal marching further into Italy. The sense of invincibility that Rome had long relied upon was shattered. The Republic realized that it was no longer merely facing a foreign invader. It was facing a genius strategist who could outthink and outmaneuver even the mightiest legions. Hannibal, meanwhile, did not press immediately toward Rome. He understood the limits of his army and the risks of overextension. His victory at Trasimene was a demonstration of his tactical brilliance, a warning to Rome that every move needed to be calculated. The massacre had shown that even the largest, most disciplined army could be destroyed if arrogance and impatience were exploited. Lake Trasimene became a lesson in strategy, patience, and the deadly consequences of underestimating one's enemy. Hannibal's reputation as the master of ambush spread across the Mediterranean. Rome, humbled and fearful, would now have to fight smarter, adapt faster, and respect the genius of a commander who had turned terrain, timing, and deception into a weapon more powerful than any legion. The legacy of Lake Trasimene. The massacre at Lake Trasimene left an indelible mark on history. Hannibal's ambush was not just a victory in battle, it became a masterclass in military strategy that would be studied for centuries. Armies across the ancient world, and even into modern times, would analyze how one man used terrain, deception, and patience to annihilate an enemy far larger than his own forces. Hannibal's brilliance lay in his ability to think beyond conventional tactics. He understood that war was not only fought with weapons but also with the mind. By manipulating the environment, luring the enemy into a trap, and striking with precise timing, he turned the Roman army's strengths into weaknesses. The Valley of Lake Trasimene became a symbol of the deadly effectiveness of strategy over sheer numbers. For Rome, Trasimene was a harsh lesson in humility. The Republic realized that their military might alone was not enough. Understanding the enemy, respecting their capabilities, and anticipating deception were crucial to survival. This lesson would influence Roman strategy in the years to come, leading them to adopt more cautious and calculated approaches when facing Hannibal in future battles. The ambush also cemented Hannibal's reputation as one of the greatest military minds of all time. Even centuries later, generals studied his campaigns, marveling at his use of terrain, timing, and psychology. Lake Trasimene became synonymous with the concept of a perfectly executed ambush, a cautionary tale that has inspired strategists from the ancient world to modern military academies. Today, historians and enthusiasts continue to visit the shores of Lake Trasimene, imagining the misty morning when a Roman army marched blindly into one of history's most devastating traps. The valley serves as a reminder that victory is not always determined by numbers or strength, but by cunning, preparation, and the ability to outthink one's opponent. The massacre at Lake Trasimene remains a timeless story of strategy, patience, and ingenuity, a testament to Hannibal's genius and a warning that even the mightiest armies can fall when overconfidence meets careful planning. Lessons from Lake Trasimene. The massacre at Lake Trasimene was more than a battle. It was a lesson in strategy, patience, and the deadly power of foresight. Hannibal Barca had shown the world that intelligence, cunning, and mastery of terrain could overcome even the mightiest of armies. The Roman legions, confident and disciplined, were undone not by fear, but by underestimating their opponent. History remembers Lake Trasimene not just for the bloodshed, but for the genius behind it. Hannibal's ambush reshaped Roman strategy, inspired generations of military leaders, and cemented his legacy as one of the greatest tacticians in history. It reminds us that in war, as in life, thinking ahead, reading your environment, and anticipating your adversary can be more powerful than brute strength alone. As we reflect on this legendary battle, we see the enduring truth: victories are often won not just on the battlefield, but in the mind. Hannibal's brilliance turned a quiet valley into a stage of terror and triumph, leaving lessons that echo through the ages. If you found this story of cunning, courage, and strategy fascinating, make sure to like, share,